I have with me on the stage here Senator Doug Cameron to my left, the Shadow Minister for Housing and Homelessness from the Australian Labor Party. Make Doug welcome. That's right, you are from the Australian Labor Party. I've got that right, haven't I? Dr. Rebecca Huntley, who's the Head of Research at Essential Media. Great insights from qualitative research she's going to share with us today. Welcome, Rebecca. And Eva Scheerlinck, the Chief Executive Officer of AIST, who has come to frame the conversation for us at the beginning. Please welcome Eva back to the stage. You do have quite a bit of credibility to bring to this, Eva, given that you have not as yet dyed your hair pink, as she promised to do last night for $1,000. And I think that there's got to be some way that you can do something through the member base of AIST to increase the amount of money that you're going to make to dye your hair pink, and with the attendant impact on your credibility. But we might come up with that a little later. Talk to us to start with, frame this conversation for us around housing affordability, the Great Divide.
Well, clearly I'm not a good auctioneer, only auctioning off my hair for $1,000.
Dreadful.
So next year we're going to have to do way better than that. But the reason, I guess, that we decided to invest in this research, Home Truths, which we launch today, is because obviously superannuation and people's retirement is a lot more about than about the money that they put away in a superannuation fund and the accumulation that they do over a working life. There are other social factors that impact on the dignity that people have in retirement. And as you know, at this conference last year, we launched another piece of research done by Saul Eslake, which was housing trends and retirement wellbeing. And that was pretty scary. The research that we launched last year said that there is, a declining home ownership in Australia. We all know about the housing affordability crisis, but, the relationship to retirement savings is pretty significant. The system as it currently is based on the fact that people will own their own home by the time they get to retirement, and increasingly that's not going to be the case. More and more people are going to be renting in retirement, and they're also taking significant amounts of debt into retirement. So we have a problem there, right? There's a range of policies, I guess, that we need in this country in order to improve housing security, housing affordability, for not just for young people, but clearly now also for the older generation. So negative gearing we've decided to focus on this year in our research. And why is that? Well, because we know it's a huge driver against housing affordability. It decreases home ownership and it fuels prices. So it just adds to this housing affordability problem that we have. It encourages households to borrow, and I think we've seen from stories that have been around the Royal Commission just in the last week or so, that the lending practices of banks have been making it so easy for people to get a lot of debt and to get all of these investment properties, and they're now in serious financial trouble. And also, it decreases the tax revenue that the government can collect, and that is obviously problematic because it puts pressure on the age pension. So that's the reason why we decided to do this piece of research. I'm really excited to be talking about it today with Rebecca and with Doug.
Thanks very much for that. And just to note that through the Cmsf app, I can receive questions throughout the presentations ahead of the formal Q&A session at the end, so get those questions in. Now, Rebecca, I'm going to ask you to talk through some research with slides for 10 minutes or so on this one.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to tell you a little bit about this terrific research we did at Essential for AIST. The research was both qualitative and quantitative, so we did both a survey and some interviews with parents and children. I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. But we started both Essential and also AIST with some key research questions. The first is, who is negatively gearing properties? But more importantly, what is driving them, particularly parents? What are the motivations for them to buy investment properties and to negative gear? And who gets or is seen to get the most benefit from negative gearing? So how did these groups feel about the very policy of negative gearing? And of course, implicated in all of these questions are attitudes to retirement, attitudes to housing, attitudes to your children, and attitudes to your parents. So our methodology, we really started with what we called family depth interviews. So we did 10 of those, 4 in Sydney, 4 in Melbourne, and 2 in Wollongong. We tried to get some ethnic diversity there in those groups and a mixture of socioeconomic status and numbers of properties owned. Most people really only had 1 or 2 properties and a little bit of an age spectrum, although most of the children were in their late teens or early 20s and parents, you know, in their 50s or early 60s. We did those interviews in home, which is always really interesting, sitting with people in their home talking about how they feel about their home. And then the insights from that qualitative research fed into an online public poll that we did. Basically, that was actually, we aimed for 500, we got over 600, and it was kind of half and half people who negatively gear properties and people who don't, so we were able to make some useful comparisons. Let me tell you about a man and his son that I visited in Wollongong one very hot day. I arrived at their modest home, very nice home, modest home in a suburb of Wollongong. And Malcolm was kind of in his late 50s, I think, almost 60. He was an Uber driver, but he had been lots of different things in his lifetime. He'd worked for council, he'd been a school principal. And Malcolm, and whose wife also worked full-time, Malcolm had grown up in country New South Wales, and they sold a very large house and decided to move closer to the sea. Malcolm and his wife made a decision to rent a house, even at their age, to scale back work and to put all of the money from this family home into 2 investment properties in Brisbane. He was very interesting about, I'll talk to you a little bit about some of his views about this. He was quite strangely comfortable with going into retirement with the amount of debt that he had. He thought that he would probably work in the gig economy until he was in his 70s, and his wife was desperate to not work anymore, but she was the only person bringing in a kind of stable income, so she had to continue to work. Their son was living with them. He was, his older son had moved overseas, but his son was a student at the local university studying to be a teacher. The thing that was so interesting talking to Malcolm and Sam, as a kind of, I would say, really kind of somewhat typical middle-class family, is that for Malcolm, the Australian dream was owning as many investment properties in Queensland as possible so that he could fund his retirement and the lifestyle in his retirement that he wanted, which included travel. But at some level he knew that his aspirations and his lifespan was not going to really work with exactly the amount of money he'd invested. So there was a bit of, look, I'll keep getting the money from these investment properties, and then when the debt's all too much, I'll sell them off, and then whatever's left I'll go on to the pension. I think what was interesting talking to Malcolm is that he didn't really factor into a lot of his planning issues like, let's say, a decline in housing prices, or even more importantly, health issues or other kinds of issues. Totally not interested in his super, thought that he had a very kind of broken relationship with the employment market, so his super wasn't really worth thinking about. Even though Malcolm had an idea that he would pass on some of these assets that he'd accrued in his lifetime to his son laughed about that idea. He thought all the money would be gone by the time his father shuffled off this mortal coil. He didn't seem particularly worried about that. He wanted his father to have a long and healthy life. It was just really interesting as a case study of some of the attitudes and drivers to investing in property and attitudes to retirement and other kinds of intergenerational questions around housing and income that were exposed in the research that we did. Just quickly, 2 quotes, one of them here from Malcolm talking about this idea about, are they going to have to increase the pension age? What's going to happen with super? He really kind of thought that the future was unknown for him in terms of that, and the only real protection for him was investing in property. And his son, this is very typical of the kinds of attitudes of young Australians to to housing. He just couldn't ever really see being able to afford to get into his own home as long as he lived in Wollongong, even if he married another teacher and even if both of them worked full-time. It's a pretty sad state of affairs that our teachers feel that they can't afford housing, even if both of them work full-time, if they want to have one or two children. It's a bit of an indictment about where we are as a nation. So, what is the main thing that is driving investment property or driving property investment? It's really fear of not having enough to retire. That was the primary reason why people were doing that, the investors that we talked to, and that was clear in both the qualitative research and in the quantitative research. This idea that people are going into investment property as a way to minimise their tax really wasn't as dominant as some of these other questions. You know, wanting to get ahead financially, wanting to maintain a certain kind of lifestyle, wanting to kind of protect themselves, as is certainly in their 60s and 70s, things like reduced income and health started to gather some kind of steam. It was interesting too in the qualitative research that regardless of whether a couple or a person that we were talking to had a lot of super or not a lot, it didn't actually change. So the amount of super they had or were going to accrue by the time they retired didn't really affect this view about why they were going to invest in property. So the fear of not having enough was a really huge driver. Property investment was seen to fill the gap that both superannuation and the pension don't. So it was the first safety net, really. Well, the family home, if you've still got it, is the first safety net. The property investment is another, and then super and the pension somewhere down at the bottom. For some of the people we talked to, filling the gap meant that they felt that investment in property was going to be the thing that kept food on the table. For other people, it was the thing that meant that they got to have the overseas holiday they wanted. It really depended on what kind of money they were getting out of property and how much money they had. Very kind of clear message from that investor in Melbourne: houses grow, super doesn't. One of the things that's interesting is that, you know, we came into this research thinking that potentially people were investing in property primarily for their children, but that the very architecture around negative gearing and around the kind of speculation in property investment was making it harder for their children to get into the property market. So some kind of forced in kind of circle there, forced in pact. But that really wasn't the case. I don't like stereotypes about baby boomers being selfish and wanting to spend their kids' inheritance. But there was a little bit of that in the groups. There was a little bit of this idea of like, well, we can continue to invest, the money's there, we can invest and get into some kind of debt, and that's going to not only pay for a kind of retirement, but the kind of retirement we want, which includes things like travel and so forth. So this idea that people were investing in property for their children to live in or to hand on to their children. I mean, eventually that would happen, but it was seen as very much in the future. And I tell you that the children that we interviewed had no expectation that any money would be left after their parents had finished, you know, globe-trotting around the world and all the rest of it. So the children were quite sceptical about whether much would be left for them at all. That being said, it's not that there isn't concern about housing affordability. It was quite marked across all the profiles that we talked about. The parents incredibly worried, but also with a little bit of a block about what could possibly be done. They realised that there has to be a suite of policies and initiatives to do anything about housing affordability in Australia, and getting rid of negative gearing may well be one of them. It is always depressing listening to well-educated, hard-working young Australians talk about home ownership as a dream, a fantasy or a goal, rather than something they feel they can achieve. There was moderate support for changes to negative gearing. Obviously, the strongest support from those who don't utilise it. But I think what's interesting is that you know, one of the things interesting to me, and some of the rhetoric around the idea of getting rid of negative gearing, is that the community won't accept it if it means any change to property prices. And that was actually not the case. In the quantitative research, we asked people, how would you feel opposed or supportive to changes in negative gearing, even if it meant that prices were to fall slightly as a result? And you still get a reasonably, not a majority support, but a reasonably good support for that concept. So generally, Australians think that doing something about negative gearing, particularly for people who want to buy 3 or 4 or 5 properties, is probably a good idea as part of like I said, a suite of policies that could do something about housing affordability. And just finally, and this was the scariest thing for me, talking particularly to investors, especially kind of quite modest earning middle-class investors, is the amount of debt they were going to carry into retirement in order to invest in these to be in these kinds of investment properties. Even those like the gentleman that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, who was in the rental market, didn't even own his own home. So there is a level of comfort amongst investors about being in this kind of debt into retirement. And as Eva said, you know, the whole concept of previously that we had about a secure retirement is that you would go into it without burdened with a lot of debt, and that is certainly changing. So a few things to recap. What's driving investment in property? It's fear of not having enough in retirement, fear that the pension won't be there for you or your super won't stretch. Property investment was seen to fill this gap that neither of those two, those two kind of financial safety nets would be there for. The needs of investors' children not playing as strong a role because the concern about retirement is so acute. They feel that they can help their children in other ways, and the children are very sceptical about any money being left at the end. That doesn't mean there isn't widespread concern about affordable housing in the younger generation, and that is certainly got to be one of the reasons why you've even got an acceptance of needing to get rid of negative gearing, even if there is a slight decrease in housing prices. And like I said, the most concerning thing coming out of the research is about how much some of these negative gearers are how much debt they're carrying into retirement. And as we know, with rising health costs, rising housing costs generally, if you're renting, that's quite a precarious place for some of these people pursuing the great Australian dream of having lots of investment properties, are risking. Thanks very much.
That's fascinating, isn't it? And we had a session yesterday, I was saying to Rebecca, which was dealing with the ways in which people might use big data to inform various demographic groups to anticipate what their prejudices are, and to sort of start to use behavioural economics to influence their nudge them towards their best investment decisions. And one of the key things that came out of it was that, exactly as you've said, people think they don't have enough, and then when they actually got together with the Chase Manhattan Bank and de-identified data and chopped it all sorts of different ways in order to come up with some quite good diagrams about how much money people actually need in retirement, and they need far less money than they think. And she described it, which I thought was a great takeaway for me, the go-go years. You probably have all heard this, go-go years, 65 to 75, where you're probably going to need a lot of money because you go-go from the international airport, which is, a middle-class story, clearly. The slow-go years, where you'll need much less money than typically you'll anticipate you will, according to this American research, and then the oh-no years, which, given that we have a functioning health system in Australia, is not so much of an oh-no if you take the mortality out of it. Doug.
Well, thanks, everyone. Firstly, could I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Thanks to Eva for the invite and my fellow panellists, Ellen and Rebecca. I just want to take a different tack on this for a second, because I don't think negative gearing and capital gains tax is the big political issue. I want to go back to 2012. At the ACTU Congress, Bill Kelty a pivotal figure in the development of occupational superannuation, outlined some of the great achievements of the Australian Labor Party and the Australian trade union movement. These included modernising and growing the economy, national health care, national superannuation, and the most effective minimum wage system in the world. More recently, it was Labor who steered the country through the global financial crisis and implemented the National Disability Insurance Scheme and paid family leave. It's Labor governments who identify the great economic and social challenges and develop the policies to deal with inequality in a socially beneficial and economically responsible manner. It's Labor who works with business and the trade union movement to increase the productive performance of the nation and the international competitiveness of this country. It's the ineffectual Turnbull government that stumbles from one crisis to another, focusing internally and failing to lead effectively. It's the Turnbull government that lacks the courage and the vision to address the emerging challenges of inequality, technological change, wage stagnation and housing affordability. As the alternative government, Labor will once again address the issues of inequality, health, education, job security and domestic and international competitiveness. As a young metalworkers official in the 1980s, I was part of the movement's campaign to break the Fraser government's wage freeze, develop the social wage through the Accord process, and win career paths for blue-collar workers. One of our greatest achievements was to gain portable superannuation entitlements for working-class families. In the early 80s, unless you were in management or a public servant, you were reliant on the age pension in your retirement. There was no portability of entitlements, no vesting of employer contributions, and no concern by employers for the welfare of their workers in retirement. Employers supported by the Coalition were opposed to the introduction of occupational superannuation, and it took a Labor government and the ACTU to do two important things in tandem. One was to increase the profit share of national income above 20%, and the second was to spur investment in the economy. At the same time, we made significant improvements to the social wage, including Medicare, bulk billing, the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, superannuation, housing assistance, and home and community care for the ageing. It would be impossible to achieve such wide-ranging and important social and economic change under the current industrial relations system, which has resulted in wage stagnation and a decline in fair and effective bargaining. This is an issue that Labor will need to address in government. The declining rate of home ownership across all age groups is well known. Among young people, it's in free fall. A result of the declining rate of home ownership and unaffordable house prices is increasing numbers of people approaching or entering retirement with a mortgage debt or relying on private sector rentals. Under current policy settings, it's inevitable that this trend will accelerate over time as younger age groups already priced out of the housing market remain locked out. Owning one's own home has always been seen as a pillar of retirement. It has been implicit in our retirement incomes policy that the vast majority of retirees will own their own home outright and will have low housing costs in retirement. For those retirees who didn't own their own home, governments provided public housing, with rent charged as a proportion of tenants' income. This was a central feature of the social compact, but it is no longer the case. In the future, growing numbers of working-class retirees face insecure, expensive tenancies in the private rental market, where their housing costs are determined by market forces. As Saul Eslake's paper prepared for AIST last March made clear, these trends have significant and dire consequences for Australia's retirement income system. An increasing number of people exhaust some or all of their superannuation savings to retire their mortgage debt. The superannuation system will in effect be tasked with paying for excessive house prices driven by tax policies that benefit the top 10% of income earners. In effect, the banks are going to have first call over your members' accounts if they have a mortgage when they retire. This is not the purpose for which a Labour government and the trade union movement established universal occupational superannuation more than 25 years ago. Funding wealthy property investors was not what we fought for. We know that reforming the tax benefits of the wealthy opens us up to the usual disinformation and scare campaigns from the coalition and the vested interests that back the status quo. The same thing is happening around our announced reform of dividend imputation. We will fight for these reforms because maintaining unsustainable and unfair tax expenditures penalise the vast bulk of Australians. These are reforms that are good for the federal budget and good for your members. Removing distortions in the housing market will improve housing affordability. As a former trustee board member, I would say to you that you have a duty to guard against house price increases driven by speculative property investment and funded by tax breaks for the wealthy that results in your members' superannuation accounts being drained on retirement. Our approach to the reform of negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts on residential property investment will guard your members' accounts. By the end of the decade, our negative gearing and capital gains tax reforms will add $8 billion a year to the federal budget. Labour will be making further policy announcements on housing before the next election. Australian superannuation funds should be investing at scale in new and affordable social rental housing. They should be doing it here in Australia, not just as you are doing in the United States and in the UK. It's an asset class whose time in Australia is coming. It's not a traditional, cycle-dependent, speculative, commercial property play that will deliver short-term, double-digit returns. As trustees, you should be making sure your investment managers are doing some serious risk-return profile analysis on this emerging area. I want to close with a twin challenge for you. Firstly, I challenge you as trustees to think very carefully about the tax reforms that are necessary to take the heat out of house prices and to think very carefully about the consequences of doing nothing. When the banks raid your members' savings to pay for house prices driven ever upwards by tax breaks for the wealthy. Secondly, I challenge you to think through what you and your funds can do to develop investable products in affordable housing. While you're doing that, remember the history of why you're here. You're not here because of some mysterious outcome of the market forces. You are here because of the foresight of the Labour movement and the financial sacrifice of Australian workers. You are a product of a historic political settlement that should never be undone. Like superannuation, housing outcomes are not the product of mysterious market forces. They are the outcome of politics, and as things stand, they're working out very badly for your members, and you have a responsibility to change this. Thank you.
That's fascinating. Eva, trustees must act in the best interests of members. Is it in the best interests of members to invest in social rental housing, as Doug suggests, even if it doesn't provide the best return?
Well, it's potentially part of a portfolio, right? The best interests of members, I mean, at the moment there is some restrictions around, so the sole purpose test in superannuation poses a restriction on the way that trustees can invest and manage their portfolios. That was something that was, introduced 26 or so years ago. It's probably time to revise that, to have a look at it, to say, well, is that really what we need to be doing? Back in the day, no one thought that this would be a $2.7 trillion industry. What do we do with that power? But I do want to just reflect on a couple of things that Rebecca said. I guess it doesn't surprise me that the people in the sample group were using property in order to help, sort of save for retirement, because these people haven't been through a mature system. They probably didn't have superannuation when they first started working, and when they did, it was only 3%. So there's no way that just through compulsory superannuation for their lifetime, they've had enough to retire on, unless they're high income earners, right? So
particularly women, as you would know.
That's right. Yeah. But it does worry me that if we don't change the policy settings and people continue to invest in this way, or see, superannuation as not providing them with what they need, the risk is that they're clearly not diversified. I mean, your case study where he thought, lots of properties in Queensland, oh my God, the risk of that it's really something we need to fix.
Isn't there something even more scary coming out of this? And that is, if people are of this age, are losing their faith in, or don't have the faith that superannuation will be there to provide for their retirement in adequate amounts. So they invest, that drives up prices, and then, as Doug says, they have to use the super to pay off the cost of this inflated house that they've had. Then it doesn't matter whether they're 60 or they're 30, that lack of faith, the housing affordability crisis does undermine faith in superannuation to provide retirement incomes, because that's actually the result of, cashing your super out and giving it to the bank to pay off the mortgage. Yeah. I mean, is that you're saying that's a fundamental problem for this sector?
Look, the single biggest issue for intergenerational inequality around the world in advanced countries is housing. I mean, it's getting to a stage, if your parents don't own a home and they can't leave you a home, then you can't buy a home. That's a problem. And and look, you can do as much analysis on this as you like. I think it's pretty simple. That a young couple that are going to buy their first home, remember, a home, not an investment, are up against rich, well-heeled investors driving the price of those homes up. And that's because of problems and distortions in the tax system. If you look at where, you hear all these arguments that it's, from the coalition, that it's simply, ambulance drivers and police that are, the backbone of negative gearing and capital gains tax. If you look at the top 10 electorates by rental loss, and you measure capital gains tax and negative gearing by rental loss, guess who is number one? Wentworth, Malcolm Turnbull's seat. That's where the rich people are. They're the ones that are investing in this area. The next one is, guess where? Curtin, Julie Bishop's seat. Then it's Kooyong, Josh Frydenberg. Then Bradfield, Paul Fletcher. Then Higgins, Kelly O'Dwyer. These are not ambulance drivers that are getting the gains out of negative gearing and capital gains tax. These are rich investors in well-heeled suburbs that are driving the price up for ordinary Australians, for your members into the future. And I just got to say, and we should actually be looking at increasing the rate of superannuation, so we don't end up in this situation down the track.
Is that an election promise, Doug?
Well, we've said we support an increase in the superannuation guarantee. It's Labour that started it off. And what you have to remember in the super funds is that it was working class people's money that started this off. And what I get really angry about is listening to some of the people in the superannuation industry now telling me that the community housing industry is not professional enough to deal with, this amount of money that the super funds might want to push in. Well, I remember back in the 80s, we set up in the Metal Workers Union our superannuation fund there was a couple of union officials that couldn't spell superannuation sitting across the table from a couple of bosses that only wanted it for themselves. But look where we are now.
But
that was the forerunner. That was the forerunner to Australian super. And look where we are.
Okay, well, and interestingly, we've just had a bunch of people sitting on the stage who were little super startups. I mean, they were for profit, don't get me wrong, but they were asking people to invest with them, saying, well, it doesn't matter that we don't have expertise. And then the industry saying, well, that's good, you should invest with the top tier industry funds because we do have the expertise. So it strikes me that you can't have it both ways. But
well, I'm not trying to have it both ways. I'm simply saying that the expertise comes through experience. You make mistakes, you fix those mistakes, and look where the industry is now. It's fantastic.
Talk to me about whether or not, we've seen APRA tighten the funding guidelines, and that's to some extent taken the heat out of the market. I know I'm trying to sell a house and no one will buy it. If you know anyone who wants to buy my house, let me know. One imagines, therefore, that an end to negative gearing, except on new housing and the changes that Labor would propose to make to the capital gains tax regime, would further depress housing prices. Among the people that you speak to, what would be the attitude to that? Because they imagine that, it seems to me that Australians imagine that they will negative gear a property or two, even though they possibly won't.
Almost certainly won't. Australians have an understandably mixed view about housing prices and what drives them, which is why you need to take any research on things like negative gearing and capital gains tax with a grain of salt, because they don't really know what it is that drives up the houses in Australia compared to elsewhere or our capital cities. So some people will say, oh, it's just how it is. And that's that point that Doug made about the magic of the market. Some people say it's about supply, but then they look at all the apartments being thrown up and they go, well, it's not really doing anything to housing prices. So, I mean, look, the research showed that a good size, we're not talking about a majority, and we're certainly talking more people who don't invest than do invest, are comfortable with the idea of some changes to negative gearing, even if there's a small decrease in housing prices, because they think it's important. Now, obviously, they don't want the property market to tumble into a hole, because even for those people trying to get into the market, younger people particularly, they don't necessarily want their parents' house to be completely worthless. They do worry. I mean, they do worry about their parents and the ability of their parents to live comfortably until they're probably going to die, which is in most cases in their mid-80s and perhaps longer. So there is, instead of a generational war, there's a little bit more generational cooperation and empathy, which is a great thing about this country, which is why we do have to get rid of the distortions in the housing market, because it's completely unfair to those often 3 and sometimes 4 generations of Australians that are trying hard to manage housing, retirement and care. When I think about that couple, that father and son at the beginning, if I was to guess what was going to happen to him when he's in his late 50s, early 60s, he's renting and he's in the gig economy, right? Which is basically a different way of saying casual work and piecework. He's got, I don't know what insurances he's got. I think it's very likely that when he retires, he'll need to sell those apartments and all of his super, and he will be stuck in the rental market, perhaps not as healthy as he is now. And his son, who will probably be a teacher, maybe a principal, married to another teacher, might have quite a large mortgage and childcare fees, if we go the way we are. So even though they're kind of living it up and travelling and thinking it's going to be okay, you can see quite a rocky trajectory for them. And they're investing. If you think about everybody else who's just done the normal thing, they've got the mortgage, then you really do worry.
2 quick questions. Eva, outside the call to action on social rental housing, what do you see as the role of super funds to improve the housing ownership divide?
Well, $2.7 trillion and, everyone looks to superannuation to fix all the social problems in Australia. And that's just not what superannuation is for, and I think we have to probably start from there. There's been a lot of, sort of shifting between federal government and state government, back to federal government to local government. Whose responsibility is it to provide, sort of low-income housing and affordable housing for people? We do need to look at what some of the current policy settings are. Maybe the industry and government need to work together about what are the blockers and move forward in that way. But just saying it's superannuation's problem, I think that's not the way it's going to be fixed.
And I can't let you go, Doug, without a political question. This policy of Labor's to abolish cashback share dividend imputation, taking some heat on this, particularly ahead of the Batman by-election. 2 questions. Do you think it'll have an impact in Batman? And secondly, is Labor going to stay the course on that policy, or will they have to adjust it somewhat to take account of the 14,000 full pensioners and 200,000 part pensioners who'd be affected by the change?
Just before I come to that, just let me make 2 points that Eva made, that it's time to look at the sole purpose test. Super funds can invest in an alternate investment area without the sole purpose test changing. So there should not be an excuse about investing in social housing because of the sole purpose test. That's an excuse. It's not a proper approach on it. Secondly, the super funds are there not to solve all the social problems. The super funds are there to make sure workers get a decent retirement, a retirement with dignity. But if you retire with massive debts, if you retire with no capacity to have your super fund other than the banks are going to take it off you, it's a legitimate issue for the super funds to be engaged in. No question about that. In terms of our recent policy announcements, it's in the same case as the negative gearing and capital gains tax. It's about making sure that we are investing as a government on the issues that make life better for everyone, not for a small group of rich, well-heeled Australians making significant gains at the expense of everyone else. So yes, we will stay the course. I don't think it will be a huge influence in Batman. There's other issues in Batman that are key issues, but I don't think this is a key issue, because Australians genuinely want a government that is concerned about intergenerational inequality. They want a government that's tackling the big issues, and when you see our full suite of policies at the next election, we will leave this no-good government for dead.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, on that note, please thank all the members of the panel for that discussion. I suspect housing affordability will be on the agenda for many years to come, and hopefully one way or another various vested interests can get together to do something about it in the interests of the next generation.